Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're reading today again from Oliver Twist, starting with chapter 43, wherein is shown how the Artful Dodger got into trouble. And so it was you that was your own friend, was it? Asked Mr. Claypole, otherwise Bolter, when by virtue of the compact entered into between them, he had removed the next day to the Jew's house. Cod, I thought as much last night. Every man's his own friend, my dear, replied Fagin with his most insinuating grin. He hasn't as good a one as himself anywhere. Except sometimes, replied Morris Bolter, assuming the air of a man of the world. Some people are nobody's enemies but their own, you know. Don't believe that, said the Jew. When a man's his own enemy, it's only because he's too much his own friend. Not because he's careful for everybody, but himself. Pooh, pooh, there ain't such a thing in nature. There oughtn't to be, but if there is, replied Mr. Bolter. That stands to reason, said the Jew. Some conjurers say that number 3 is the magic number, and some say number 7. It's neither, my friend, neither. It's number 1. Ha ha, cried Mr. Bolter. Number 1 forever. In a little community like ours, my dear, said the Jew, who felt it necessary to qualify this position, we have a general number 1, that is, you can't consider yourself as number 1 without considering me, too, as the same, and all the other young people. Oh, the devil, exclaimed Mr. Bolter. You see, pursued the Jew, affecting to disregard this interruption, we are so mixed up together and identified in our interests that it must be so. For instance, it's your object to take care of number 1, meaning yourself. Certainly, replied Mr. Bolter. You're about right there. Well, you can't take care of yourself, number 1, without taking care of me, number 1. Number 2, you mean, said Mr. Bolter, who was largely endowed with the quality of selfishness. No, I don't, retorted the Jew. I'm of the same importance to you as you are to yourself. I say, interrupted Mr. Bolter, you're a very nice man, and I'm very fond of you, but we ain't quite so thick together as all that comes to. Only think, said the Jew, shrugging his shoulders and stretching out his hands. Only consider. You've done what's a very pretty thing, and what I love you for doing, but what at the same time would put the cravat round your throat that's so very easily tied and so very difficult to unloose, in plain English, the halter. Mr. Bolter put his hand to his neckerchief as if he felt it inconveniently tight, and murmured an assent, qualified in tone but not in substance. The gallows, continued Fagin, the gallows, my dear, is an ugly finger-post which points out a very short and sharp turning that has stopped many a bold fellow's career on the broad highway. To keep in the easy road and keep it at a distance is object number 1 with you. Of course it is, replied Mr. Bolter. What do you talk about such things for? Only to show you my meaning clearly, said the Jew, raising his eyebrows. To be able to do that, you depend upon me. To keep my little business all snug, I depend upon you. The first is your number 1, the second my number 1. The more you value your number 1, the more careful you must be of mine. So we come at last to what I told you at first, that a regard for number 1 holds us all together and must do so, unless we would all go to pieces in company. That's true, replied Mr. Bolter thoughtfully. Oh, you're a cunning old codger. Mr. Fagin saw with delight that this tribute to his powers was no mere compliment, but that he had really impressed his recruit with a sense of his wily genius, which it was most important that he should entertain in the outset of their acquaintance. To strengthen an impression so desirable and useful, he followed up the blow by acquainting him in some detail with the magnitude and extent of his operations, blending truth and fiction together as best served his purpose, and bringing both to bear with so much art that Mr. Bolter's respect visibly increased and became tempered at the same time with a degree of wholesome fear which it was highly desirable to waken. It's this mutual trust we have in each other that consoles me under heavy losses, said the Jew. My best hand was taken from me yesterday morning. You don't mean to say he died, cried Mr. Bolter. No, no, replied Fagin. Not so bad as that, not quite so bad. What? I suppose he was wanted, interposed the Jew. Yes, he was wanted. Very particular? Inquired Mr. Bolter. No, replied the Jew, not very. He was charged with attempting to pick a pocket, and they found a silver snuff-box on him. His own, my dear, his own, for he took snuff himself and was very fond of it. They remanded him till today, for they thought they knew the owner. Ah, he was worth 50 boxes, and I'd give the price of as many to have him back. You should have known the Dodger, my dear. You should have known the Dodger. Well, but I shall know him, I hope. Don't you think so? Said Mr. Bolter. I'm doubtful about it, replied the Jew with a sigh. If they don't get any fresh evidence, it'll only be a summary conviction, and we shall have him back again after 6 weeks or so. But if they do, it's a case of lagging. Excuse me. They know what a clever lad he is. He'll be a lifer. They'll make the Artful nothing less than a lifer. What do you mean by lagging and a lifer? Demanded Mr. Bolter. What's the good of talking in that way to me? Why don't you speak so as I can understand you? Miss Fagin was about to translate these mysterious expressions into the vulgar tongue, and being interpreted, Mr. Bolter would have been informed that they represented that combination of words, transportation for life, when the dialogue was cut short by the entry of Mr. Bates, with his hands in his breeches pockets, and his face twisted into a look of semi-comical woe. "It's all up, Fagin," said Charlie, when he and his new companion had been made known to each other. "What do you mean?" asked the Jew, with trembling lips. "They found the gentleman his own sabox. 2 or 3 more are coming to identify him, and the Artful's booked for a passage out," replied Mr. Bates. "I must have a full suit of mourning, Fagin, and a hatband to visit him in, afore he sets out upon his travels. To think of Jack Dawkins, Lummy Jack, the Dodger, the Artful Dodger, going abroad for a common 2-penny halfpenny sneeze box. I never thought he'd have done it under a gold watch, chain, and seals at the lowest. Oh, why didn't he rob some rich old gentleman of all his valuables and go out as a gentleman, and not like a common prig without no honor nor glory?" With this expression of feeling for his unfortunate friend, Mr. Charlie Bates sat himself on the nearest chair with an aspect of chagrin and despondency. "What do you talk about his having neither honor nor glory for?" exclaimed Fagin, darting an angry look at his pupil. "Wasn't he always top sawyer among you all? Is there one of you that could touch him, or come near him on any scent, eh?" "Not one," replied Charlie Bates, in a voice rendered husky by regret. "Not one." "Then what do you talk of?" replied the Jew angrily. "What are you blubbering for?" "'Cause it isn't on the record, is it?" said Charlie, chafed into perfect defiance of his venerable friend by the current of his regrets. "'Cause it can't come out in the dictament, 'cause nobody will ever know half of what he was. How will he stand in the Newgate calendar? Perhaps not be there at all. Oh, my eye, what a blow it is!" "Ha, ha," cried the Jew, extending his right hand, and turning to Mr. Bolter in a fit of chuckling which shook him as though he had the palsy. "See what a pride they take in their profession, my dear. Ain't it beautiful?" Mr. Bolter nodded assent, and the Jew, after contemplating the grief of Charlie Bates for some seconds with evident satisfaction, stepped up to the young gentleman and patted him on the shoulder. "Never mind, Charlie," said Fagin soothingly. "It'll come out. It'll be sure to come out. They'll all know what a clever fellow he was. He'll show it himself and not disgrace his old pals and teachers. Think how young he is, too. What a distinction, Charlie, to be lagged at his time of life." "Well, it is an honor, that is," said Charlie, a little consoled. "He shall have all he wants," continued the Jew. "He shall be kept in the stone jug, Charlie, like a gentleman, with his beer every day and money in his pocket to pitch and toss with if he can't spend it." "No, shall he, though?" cried Charlie Bates. "Aye, that he shall," replied the Jew, "and we'll have a big wig, Charlie, one that's got the greatest gift of the gab to carry on his defense, and he shall make a speech for himself, too, if he likes, and we'll read it all in the papers. 'Artful Dodger,' shrieks of laughter. 'Here the court was convulsed.' Eh, Charlie, eh?" "Ha, ha," laughed Charlie Bates. "What a lark that would be, wouldn't it, Fagin? I say, how the Artful would bother him, wouldn't he?" "Would," cried the Jew. He will." "Ah, to be sure, so he will," repeated Charlie, rubbing his hands. "I think I see him now," cried the Jew, bending his eyes upon his pupil. "So do I," cried Charlie Bates. "Ha, ha, ha, so do I. I see it all afore me. Upon my soul I do, Fagin. What a game. What a regular game. All the big wigs trying to look solemn, and Jack Dawkins addressing of 'em as intimate and comfortable as if he was the judge's own son making speech after dinner. Ha, ha, ha." In fact, the Jew had so well humored his young friend's eccentric disposition that Charlie Bates, who had at first been disposed to consider the imprisoned Dodger rather than in the light of a victim, now looked upon him as the chief actor in a scene of most uncommon and exquisite humor, and felt quite impatient for the arrival of the time when his old companion should have so favorable an opportunity of displaying his abilities. "We must know how he gets on today by some handy means or other," said Fagin. "Let me think." "Shall I go?" asked Charlie. "Not for the world," replied the Jew. "Are you mad, my dear? Stark mad that you'd walk into the very place where—" "No, Charlie, no. One is enough to lose at a time." "You don't mean to go yourself, I suppose," said Charlie with a humorous leer. "That wouldn't quite fit," replied Fagin, shaking his head. "Then why don't you send this new cove?" asked Charlie Bates, laying his hand on Noah's arm. "Nobody knows him." "Why, if he didn't mind," observed the Jew. "Mind?" interposed Charlie. "What should he have to mind?" "Really nothing, my dear," said Fagin, turning to Mr. Bolter. "Really nothing." "Oh, I dare say about that, you know," observed Noah, backing toward the door and shaking his head with a kind of sober alarm. No, none of that. It's not in my department, that ain't." "What department has he got, Fagin?" inquired Charlie Bates, surveying Noah's lank form with much disgust. "The cutting away when there's nothing wrong, and the eating all the victuals when there's everything right, is that his branch?" "Never mind," retorted Mr. Bolter, "and don't you take liberties with your superiors, little boy, or you'll find yourself in the wrong shop." Charlie Bates laughed so vehemently at this magnificent threat that it was some time before Fagin could interpose and represent to Mr. Bolter that he incurred no possible danger in visiting the police office, that inasmuch no account of the little affair in which he had been engaged, nor any description of his person, had yet been forwarded to the metropolis, it was very probable that he was not even suspected of having resorted to it for shelter, and that if he were properly disguised, it would be as safe a spot for him to visit as any in London, inasmuch as it would be, of all places, the very last to which he could be supposed likely to resort of his own free will. Persuaded in part by these representations, but overborne in a much greater degree by his fear of the Jew, Mr. Bolter at length consented, with a very bad grace, to undertake the expedition. By Fagin's directions, he immediately substituted for his own attire a waggoner's frock, velveteen breeches, and leather leggings, all of which articles the Jew had at hand. He was likewise furnished with a felt hat garnished with turnpike tickets and a carter's whip. Thus equipped, he was to saunter into the office as some country fellow from Covent Garden Market might be supposed to do for the gratification of his curiosity, and as he was so awkward, ungainly, and raw-boned a fellow as need be, Mr. Fagin had no fear but that he would look the part to perfection. These arrangements completed, he was informed of the necessary signs and tokens by which to recognize the Artful Dodger, and was conveyed by Charlie Bates through dark and winding ways to within a very short distance of Bow Street. Having described the precise situation of the office and accompanied it with copious directions how he was to walk straight up the passage, and when he got into the yard, take the door up the steps on the right-hand side, and pull off his hat as he went to the room, Charlie Bates bade him hurry on alone, and promised to bide his return on the spot of their parting. Noah Claypole, or Morris Bolter, as the reader pleases, punctiliously followed the directions he had received, which, Charlie Bates being pretty well acquainted with the locality, were so exact that he was enabled to gain the magisterial presence without asking any question or meeting with any interruption by the way. He found himself jostled among a crowd of people, chiefly women, who were huddled together in a dirty, frowsy room, at the upper end of which was a raised platform railed off from the rest, with a dock for the prisoners on the left hand against the wall, a box for the witnesses in the middle, and a desk for the magistrates on the right, the awful locality last named being screened off by a partition which concealed the bench from the common gaze, and left the vulgar to imagine, if they could, the full majesty of justice. There were only a couple of women in the dock who were nodding to their admiring friends, while the clerk read some depositions to a couple of policemen and a man in plain clothes who leaned over the table. A jailer stood reclining against the dock rail, tapping his nose listlessly with a large key, except when he repressed an undue tendency to conversation among the idlers by proclaiming silence, or looked sternly up to bid some woman take that baby out, when the gravity of justice was disturbed by feeble cries, half smothered in the mother's shawl, from some meager infant. The room smelt close and unwholesome, the walls were dirt discolored, and the ceiling blackened. There was an old smoky bust over the mantel-shelf and a dusty clock above the dock, the only thing present that seemed to go on as it ought, for depravity, or poverty, or a habitual acquaintance with both, had left a taint on all the animate matter, hardly less unpleasant than the thick, greasy scum on every inanimate object that frowned upon it. Noah looked eagerly about him for the Dodger, but although there were several women who have done very well for that distinguished character's mother or sister, and more than one man who might be supposed to bear a strong resemblance to his father, nobody at all answering the description given him of Mr. Dawkins was to be seen. He waited in a state of much suspense and uncertainty until the women, being committed for trial, went flaunting out, and then was quickly relieved by the appearance of another prisoner who he felt at once could be no other than the object of his visit. It was indeed Mr. Dawkins, who, shuffling into the office with the big coat sleeves tucked up as usual, his left hand in his pocket, and his hat in his right hand, preceded the jailer with a rolling gait altogether indescribable, and taking his place in the dock, requested in an audible voice to know what he was placed in that here disgraceful situation for. "Hold your tongue, will you?" said the jailer. "I'm an Englishman, ain't I?" rejoined the Dodger. "Where are my privileges?" "You'll get your privileges soon enough," retorted the jailer, "and pepper with 'em." "We'll see what the Secretary of State for the Home Affairs has got to say to the beaks if I don't," replied Mr. Dawkins. "Now then, what is this here business? I shall thank the magistrates to dispose of this here little affair, and not to keep me while they read the paper, for I've got an appointment with a gentleman in the city, and as I'm a man of my word and very punctual in business matters, he'll go away if I ain't there to my time, and then perhaps there won't be an action for damage against him as kept me away. Oh, no, certainly not." At this point the Dodger, with a show of being very particular with a view to proceedings to be had thereafter, desired the jailer to communicate the names of them two files as was on the bench, which so tickled the spectators that they laughed almost as heartily as Charlie Bates could have done if he had heard the request. "Silence there!" cried the jailer. "What is this?" inquired one of the magistrates. "A pickpocketing case, your worship. Has the boy ever been here before?" "He ought to have been a many times," replied the jailer. "He has been pretty well everywhere else. I know him well, your worship." "Oh, you know me, do you?" cried the Artful, making a note of the statement. "Very good. Then a case of defamation of character, anyway." Here there was another laugh and another cry of silence. "Now then, where are the witnesses?" said the clerk. "Ah, that's right," added the Dodger. "Where are they? I should like to see 'em." This wish was immediately gratified, for a policeman stepped forward who had seen the prisoner attempt the pocket of an unknown gentleman in a crowd, and indeed take a handkerchief therefrom, which, being a very old one, he deliberately put back again after trying it on his own countenance. For this reason, he took the Dodger into custody as soon as he could get near him, and the said Dodger, being searched, had upon his person a silver snuff-box with the owner's name engraved upon the lid. This gentleman had been discovered on reference to the court guide, and being then and there present, swore that the snuff-box was his, and that he had missed it on the previous day, the moment he had disengaged himself from the crowd before referred to. He had also remarked a young gentleman in the throng particularly active in making his way about, and that young gentleman was the prisoner before him. "Have you anything to ask this witness, boy?" said the magistrate. I wouldn't abase myself by descending to hold no conversation with him," replied the Dodger. "Have you anything to say at all?" "Do you hear his worship ask if you have anything to say?" inquired the jailer, nudging the silent Dodger with his elbow. "I beg your pardon," said the Dodger, looking up with an air of abstraction. "Did you address yourself to me, my man?" "I never see such an out-and-out young vagabond, your worship," observed the officer with a grin. "Do you mean to say anything, you young shaver?" "No," replied the Dodger, "not here, for this ain't the shop for justice. Besides which, my attorney is breakfasting this morning with the vice president of the House of Commons. But I shall have something to say elsewhere, and so will he. And so will a very numerous and respectable circle of acquaintance as'll make them beaks wish they'd never been born, or that they'd got their footmen to hang 'em up to their own hat pegs before they let 'em comin' out this morning to try it upon me. There, he's fully committed," interposed the clerk. "Take him away." "Come on," said the jailer. "Oh, I'll come on," replied the Dodger, brushing his hat with the palm of his hand. To the bench. "It's no use your looking frightened. I won't show you no mercy, not a ha'porth of it. You'll pay for this, my fine fellers. I wouldn't be you for something. I wouldn't go free now if you was to fall down on your knees and ask me. Here, carry me off to prison. Take me away." With these last words, the Dodger suffered himself to be led off by the collar, threatening, till he got into the yard, to make a parliamentary business of it, and then grinning in the officer's face with great glee and self-approval. Having seen him locked up by himself in a little cell, Noah made the best of his way back to where he had left Charlie Bates. After waiting here some time, he was joined by that young gentleman, who had prudently abstained from showing himself until he had looked carefully abroad from a snug retreat, and ascertained that his new friend had not been followed by any impertinent person. The two hastened back together to bear to Mr. Fagin the animating news that the Dodger was doing full justice to his bringing up and establishing for himself a glorious reputation. Chapter 44. The time arrives for Nancy to redeem her pledge to Rose Maylie. She fails. Adept as she was in all the arts of cunning and dissimulation, the girl Nancy could not wholly conceal the effect which the knowledge of the steps she had taken worked upon her mind. She remembered that both the crafty Jew and the brutal Sykes had confided to her schemes which had been hidden from all others, in the full confidence that she was trustworthy and beyond the reach of their suspicion. Vile as those schemes were, desperate as were their originators, and bitter as were her feelings toward the Jew, who had led her step by step deeper and deeper down into an abyss of crime and misery whence was no escape, still there were times when, even toward him, she felt some relenting, lest her disclosure should bring him within the iron grasp he had so long eluded, and he should fall at last, richly as he merited such a fate, by her hand. But these were the mere wanderings of a mind unable wholly to detach itself from old companions and associations, though enabled to fix itself steadily on one object and resolved not to be turned aside by any consideration. Her fears for Sykes would have been more powerful inducements to recoil while there was yet time, but she had stipulated that her secret should be rigidly kept. She had dropped no clue which could lead to his discovery. She had refused even, for his sake, a refuge from all the guilt and wretchedness that encompassed her. And what more could she do? She was resolved. Though all her mental struggles terminated in this conclusion, they forced themselves upon her again and again, and left their traces too. She grew pale and thin even within a few days. At times she took no heed of what was passing before her, or no part in conversations where once she would have been the loudest. At other times she laughed without merriment and was noisy without cause or meaning. At others, often within a moment afterwards, She sat silent and dejected, brooding with her head upon her hands, while the very effort by which she roused herself told more forcibly than even these indications that she was ill at ease, and that her thoughts were occupied with matters very different and distant from those in course of discussion by her companions. It was Sunday night, and the bell of the nearest church struck the hour. Sikes and the Jew were talking, but they paused to listen. The girl looked up from the low seat on which she crouched and listened too. 11. An hour this side of midnight, said Sikes, raising the blind to look out and returning to his seat. Dark and heavy it is, too. A good night for business, this. Ah, replied the Jew, what a pity, Bill, my dear, that there's none quite ready to be done. You're right for once, replied Sikes gruffly. It's a pity, for I'm in the humor, too. The Jew sighed and shook his head despondingly. We must make up for lost time when we've got things in a good train. That's all I know, said Sikes. That's the way to talk, my dear, replied the Jew, venturing to pat him on the shoulder. It does me good to hear you. Does you good, does it? Cried Sikes. Well, so be it. Ha, 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 laughed the Jew, as if he were relieved by even this concession. You're like yourself tonight, Bill, quite like yourself. I don't feel like myself when you lay that withered old claw on my shoulder. So take it away, said Sikes, casting off the Jew's hand. It makes you nervous, Bill? Reminds you of being nabbed, does it? Said the Jew, determined not to be offended. Reminds me of being nabbed by the devil, returned Sikes. There never was another man with such a face as yours, unless it was your father, and I suppose he is singeing his grizzled red beard by this time, unless you came straight from the old one without any father at all betwixt you, which I shouldn't wonder at a bit. Fagin offered no reply to this compliment, but pulling Sikes by the sleeve, pointed his finger toward Nancy, who had taken advantage of the foregoing conversation to put on her bonnet, and was now leaving the room. Hello, cried Sikes. Nance, where's the girl going to at this time of night? Not far. What answers that? Returned Sikes. Where are you going? I say not far. And I say where, retorted Sikes. Do you hear me? I don't know where, replied the girl. Then I do, said Sikes, more in the spirit of obstinacy than because he had any real objection to the girl going where she liked. Nowhere. Sit down. I'm not well. I told you that before, rejoined the girl. I want a breath of air. Put your head out of the window, replied Sikes. There's not enough there, said the girl. I want it in the street. Then you won't have it, replied Sikes, with which assurance he rose, locked the door, took the key out, and pulling her bonnet from her head, flung it up to the top of an old press. There, said the robber. Now stop quietly where you are, will you? It's not such a matter as a bonnet would keep me, said the girl, turning very pale. What do you mean, Bill? Do you know what you're doing? Know what I'm... Oh, cried Sikes, turning to Fagin. She's out of her senses, you know, or she daren't talk to me in that way. You'll drive me on to something desperate, muttered the girl, placing both hands upon her breast as though to keep down by force some violent outbreak. Let me go, will you, this minute, this instant? No, said Sikes. Tell him to let me go, Fagin. He had better. It'll be better for him. Do you hear me? Cried Nancy, stamping her foot upon the ground. Hear you, repeated Sikes, turning round in his chair to confront her. Aye, and if I hear you for half a minute longer, the dog shall have such a grip on your throat as'll tear some of that screaming voice out. What has come over you, you jade? What is it? Let me go, said the girl, with great earnestness. Then, sitting herself down on the floor before the door, she said, Bill, let me go. You don't know what you're doing. You don't indeed, for only 1 hour. Do. Cut my limbs off one by one, cried Sikes, seizing her roughly by the arm. If I don't think the gal's stark raving mad. Get up. Not till you let me go. Not till you let me go. Never, never, screamed the girl. Sikes looked on for a minute, watching his opportunity, and suddenly pinioning her hands, dragged her, struggling and wrestling with him by the way, into a small room adjoining, where he sat himself on a bench, and thrusting her into a chair, held her down by force. She struggled and implored by turns until 12 o'clock had struck, and then, wearied and exhausted, ceased to contest the point any further. With a caution, backed by many oaths, to make no more efforts to go out that night, Sikes left her to recover at leisure and rejoined the Jew. Phew, said the housebreaker, wiping the perspiration from his face. What a precious strange gal that is. You may say that, Bill, replied the Jew thoughtfully. You may say that. What did she take it into her head to go out tonight for, do you think? Asked Sikes. Come, you should know her better than me. What does it mean? Obstinacy. Woman's obstinacy, I suppose, my dear, replied the Jew, shrugging his shoulders. Well, I suppose it is, growled Sikes. I thought I had tamed her, but she's as bad as ever. Worse, said the Jew thoughtfully. I never knew her like this, for such a little cause. Nor I, said Sikes. I think she's got a touch of that fever in her blood yet, and it won't come out, eh? Like enough, replied the Jew. I'll let her a little blood without troubling the doctor if she's took that way again, said Sikes. The Jew nodded in expressive approval of this mode of treatment. She was hanging about me all day and night, too, when I was stretched on my back, and you, like a black-hearted wolf as you are, kept yourself aloof, said Sikes. We was very poor, too, all the time, and I think, one way or another, it's worried and fretted her, and that being shut up here so long has made her restless, eh? That's it, my dear, replied the Jew in a whisper. Hush! As he uttered these words, the girl herself appeared and resumed her former seat. Her eyes were swollen and red. She rocked herself to and fro, tossed her head, and after a little time burst out laughing. "Why, now she's on the other tack," exclaimed Sikes, turning a look of excessive surprise on his companion. The Jew nodded to him to take no further notice just then, and in a few moments the girl subsided into her accustomed demeanor. Whispering to Sikes that there was no fear of her relapsing, Fagin took up his hat and bade him good night. He paused when he reached the room door, and looking round asked if somebody would light him down the dark stairs. "Light him down," said Sikes, who was filling his pipe. "It's a pity he should break his neck himself and disappoint the sightseers. Show him a light." Nancy followed the old man downstairs with a candle. When they reached the passage, he laid a finger on his lip and, drawing close to the girl, said in a whisper, "What is it, Nancy dear?" "What do you mean?" replied the girl in the same tone. "The reason of all this," replied Fagin. "If he pointed with his skinny forefinger up the stairs, is so hard with you, he's a brute, Nancy, a brute beast. Why don't you—" "Well," said the girl, as Fagin paused, with his mouth almost touching her ear and his eyes looking into hers. "No matter just now," said the Jew. "We'll talk of this again. You have a friend in me, Nancy, a staunch friend. I have the means at hand, quiet and close. If you want revenge on those that treat you like a dog, worse than a dog, for he humors them sometimes, come to me. I say, come to me. He is the mere hound of a day, but you know me of old, Nance." "I know you well," replied the girl, without manifesting the least emotion. "Good night." She shrunk back as Fagin offered to lay his hand on hers, but said good night again in a steady voice, and answering his parting look with a nod of intelligence, closed the door between them. Fagin walked towards his own home, intent upon the thoughts that were working within his brain. He had conceived the idea, not from what had just passed, though that had tended to confirm him, but slowly and by degrees, that Nancy, wearied of the housebreaker's brutality, had conceived an attachment for some new friend. Her altered manner, her repeated absences from home alone, her comparative indifference to the interests of the gang for which she had once been so zealous, and added to these her desperate impatience to leave home that night at a particular hour, all favored the supposition, and rendered it, to him at least, almost a matter of certainty. The object of this new liking was not among his myrmidons. He would be a valuable acquisition with such an assistant as Nancy, and must, thus Fagin argued, be secured without delay. There was another and a darker object to be gained. Sikes knew too much, and his ruffian taunts had not galled the Jew the less because the wounds were hidden. The girl must know well that if she shook him off, she could never be safe from his fury, and that it would be surely wreaked to the maiming of limbs, or perhaps the loss of life, on the object of her more recent fancy. With a little persuasion, thought Fagin, what more likely than that she would consent to poison him? Women have done such things and worse to secure the same object before now. There would be the dangerous villain, the man I hate, gone, another secured in his place, and my influence over the girl, with a knowledge of this crime to back it, unlimited. These things passed through the mind of Fagin during the short time he sat alone in the housebreaker's room, and with them uppermost in his thoughts, he had taken the opportunity afterwards afforded him of sounding the girl in the broken hints he threw out at parting. There was no expression of surprise, no assumption of an inability to understand his meaning. The girl clearly comprehended it. Her glance at parting showed that. But perhaps she would recoil from a plot to take the life of Sikes, and that was one of the chief ends to be attained. How, thought the Jew as he crept homewards, can I increase my influence with her? What new power can I acquire? Such brains are fertile in expedients. If, without extracting a confession from herself, he laid a watch, discovered the object of her altered regard, and threatened to reveal the whole history to Sikes, of whom she stood in no common fear, unless she entered into his designs, could he not secure her compliance? "I can," said Fagin, almost aloud. "She durst not refuse me then. Not for her life. Not for her life. I have it all. The means are ready and shall be set to work. I shall have you yet." He cast back a dark look and a threatening motion of the hand toward the spot where he had left the bolder villain, and went on his way, busying his bony hands in the folds of his tattered garment, which he wrenched tightly in his grasp, as though there were a hated enemy crushed with every motion of his fingers. And we'll stop there and start next time with Chapter 45. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.